Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we uncover the extraordinary tales that connect us through love, pain, and hope. Today's story unravels the life of a grieving millionaire who stumbles upon an astonishing truth, a discovery tied to his late wife that will change everything. Stay tuned for this unforgettable journey. It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Mill Creek, nestled on the outskirts of South Carolina. But the air was thick with the weight of history. The kind of history you can't ignore, no matter how many years pass. The sun barely peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. People moved about their business, going through the motions of their everyday lives. But for some, the ghosts of the past were never far away. Jasmine Thompson stood at the old courthouse steps, her eyes fixed on the massive building ahead of her. It had been nearly 2 decades since she left this town. In those years, she had worked hard to forget the injustices she had witnessed, to build a life far away from the streets she grew up on. She had worked hard to be someone different, someone who could escape the shadow that had loomed over her life. But standing here now, she realized that you can never outrun your past. Not truly. The sound of her heels echoed in the empty street as she made her way toward the courthouse. She had received a letter earlier that week, one she wasn't expecting but had always known would come eventually. It was from her old friend, Marcus Wright, the man who had been there the day everything changed. Marcus had been like a brother to her, someone who understood the struggles she faced growing up as a young black girl in Mill Creek. They had both seen the way the town treated their people, the way justice seemed to always slip through their fingers no matter how hard they fought for it. And now, years later, Marcus was calling her back. He had found something that could finally bring justice for those who never got it. She pushed open the heavy doors of the courthouse and stepped inside, the smell of old wood and paper filling the air. The receptionist looked up, startled by her sudden presence. But Jasmine smiled softly, trying to ease the woman's unease. "I'm here to see Marcus Wright," she said, her voice steady but filled with an emotion she couldn't quite suppress. The receptionist nodded and picked up the phone. As Jasmine waited, her mind wandered back to the events that had brought her here. It had been one of the hottest summers Mill Creek had ever seen, the kind of heat that made you sweat just by stepping outside. And it had been the summer that everything had changed, the summer that had burned the past into her memory. She remembered the day like it was yesterday. Marcus and his brother Elijah had been walking home from the park, laughing about some joke Marcus had told, when a group of white teenagers had approached them. It wasn't unusual for this kind of thing to happen in Mill Creek. Racial tensions had always been simmering beneath the surface, and people like Marcus and Elijah were easy targets for the town's more privileged residents. But this time, it was different. The teens had made their usual remarks, calling them names, laughing as if it was a game. Marcus and Elijah had tried to ignore them, to keep walking. But one of the boys, Kyle Preston, had taken it too far. He had shoved Elijah, knocking him to the ground. And when Marcus stepped in to protect his brother, Kyle had pulled out a knife. It was over in an instant. Marcus had been too slow to react, and Elijah had paid the price. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened in Mill Creek, but it was the first time Jasmine had seen someone she loved become the victim of such senseless violence. The police had come, of course, but the investigation had been a farce. Kyle Preston came from one of the wealthiest families in town, and his father was well-connected in local politics. No charges were filed. The incident was swept under the rug. That was the moment Jasmine had vowed to leave Mill Creek. She couldn't stand seeing the system fail over and over again, knowing that people like Kyle would never be held accountable. But Marcus had stayed. He had stayed because, unlike her, he couldn't forget. He couldn't accept the idea that his brother's death would mean nothing. And now, 2 decades later, Marcus had called her back, telling her that he had found a way to finally bring justice for Elijah. Jasmine wasn't sure what that meant yet, but she knew it would involve facing the demons of her past, something she had never been ready to do. Until now. The receptionist hung up the phone and gestured for Jasmine to follow her. As they walked down the hallway, Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what Marcus had uncovered, but she could feel the weight of it already. When they reached the small office at the end of the hall, Jasmine took a deep breath and knocked on the door. The door opened slowly, and there stood Marcus Wright. Time had changed him in subtle ways. His hair had turned gray, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he still had that same determined look in his eyes, the one that made Jasmine believe he could fight a losing battle and still win. "Jasmine," Marcus said, his voice rough but warm. "I'm glad you came." "I didn't have a choice," she replied, stepping inside. And just like that, the wall she had built around her for so many years began to crumble. The past was no longer something she could ignore. It was time to face it, to confront the injustices that had been buried for too long. The fight for justice had begun again, and this time, they wouldn't back down. Jasmine took a seat in the small office, the familiar yet unfamiliar surroundings overwhelming her. The walls, lined with photographs of a Mill Creek that no longer existed, seemed to close in around her. Everything about this place was a reminder of why she had left in the first place, why she had chosen to escape the shadow of racial injustice that loomed over her and everyone she cared about. Marcus took a seat across from her, his eyes still filled with the fire of someone who had never stopped seeking justice. He handed her a manila folder, thick with documents and photographs, some of which seemed to blur into each other in her hands as her fingers trembled. "You've found something," Jasmine said, her voice barely a whisper. She could already feel the weight of what was to come, but she had no idea how heavy it would be. Marcus nodded, his lips set in a tight line. "I've been digging for years. Jasmine, Elijah's death, it wasn't just some random act of violence. It was part of something bigger, something that no one ever wanted to talk about. I've been trying to uncover it, piece by piece, and I think I finally have enough to make them listen." Jasmine opened the folder, scanning through the first few pages. What she saw took her breath away. It was a report from the Mill Creek Police Department, detailing the events of Elijah's death, but it wasn't the official version. This was the version the police had kept hidden. There were witness statements, statements from local residents who had seen the entire altercation. And yet, in the official report, there was no mention of how Kyle Preston had a history of harassment, or how he had been known to carry a weapon. The report, the one that the public had seen, painted Elijah as the aggressor. It was a blatant lie. Jasmine's fingers trembled as she turned the page, revealing more disturbing details, documents that linked Kyle's family to political donations, to city officials who had turned a blind eye to the growing violence in the town. Kyle Preston's father, Richard Preston, had used his wealth and influence to make sure his son's actions would be covered up, to make sure that the truth about Elijah's murder would never see the light of day. "This is insane," Jasmine muttered, her voice cracking. "They've been hiding this for years, and no one's done anything about it. I couldn't just sit by." "Jasmine," Marcus said quietly, "not after everything we went through. After Elijah was gone, they think they can sweep it all under the rug. But I won't let them. We need to make sure everyone knows what happened." She nodded, feeling the fire in Marcus's words ignite something inside her. They couldn't let this go. Elijah's death had been a turning point, and the fight for justice had to continue. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice steady, but her heart racing. Marcus stood, pacing across the room, the papers in his hands fluttering like wings. "I've already started making connections. There's a group of people who are just as sick of this as we are. They've been trying to expose the corruption for years. The press, the district attorney, they've all been bought off by the Prestons. But now we have the proof. This is bigger than just Elijah's death. This is about a system that's been broken for too long." Jasmine felt a pang of guilt. She had left Mill Creek, left Marcus, when she couldn't bear to fight anymore. She had convinced herself that by leaving, she was protecting herself, protecting her heart from the constant hurt that came with seeing her community suffer. But now, as she looked at Marcus, she saw that she couldn't keep running anymore. Elijah hadn't run, and neither could she. "So, what's next?" Jasmine asked, feeling her resolve harden. Marcus looked at her, a glimmer of hope finally breaking through his normally guarded expression. "We go public. We tell the truth. We bring the fight to their doorsteps. The whole town needs to know who Kyle Preston is, who his family is, and we make sure the Prestons can't buy their way out of this anymore. Jasmine felt a fire in her chest, a sense of purpose she hadn't had in years. She had been running, hiding from the world and the pain of it all. But Marcus was right. They couldn't let this lie persist. Not now. Not anymore. With the weight of the truth in her hands, Jasmine stood up, determination settling deep in her bones. "Let's do it," she said, her voice firm. "Let's make them listen." They spent the next few hours strategizing. Marcus reached out to contacts within the town, people who had long been ignored or silenced by the Prestons' power. They made calls to local journalists, worked with attorneys who were willing to stand up against the overwhelming odds. Slowly, step by step, they built a plan that would shake Mill Creek to its core. The next morning, as the sun rose over the town, Jasmine and Marcus were already at work. They held a press conference in front of the courthouse, ready to tell the story of Elijah's death, ready to expose the lies that had kept the truth buried for so long. They were no longer fighting just for Elijah. They were fighting for the entire town, for the community that had been left behind by a broken system. As the crowd gathered, murmurs rippling through the air, Jasmine took a deep breath. She knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The people of Mill Creek had been conditioned to believe the lies. They had been told time and time again that the wealthy and powerful were above reproach, that justice was a game for the elite. But Jasmine and Marcus were here to change that. They were here to bring the truth into the light, to make sure that everyone knew what had really happened. She stepped forward to the podium, her hands steady but her heart pounding, and she spoke the words that would change everything. "This is for Elijah. This is for all of us who have been silenced for too long. Today, we demand justice." The battle for truth had begun, and there would be no turning back. The courthouse steps were crowded. News cameras, reporters, and curious onlookers gathered in anticipation, not knowing what they were about to witness. Mill Creek had never been a place where the truth came easily. For years, the voices of the oppressed had been muffled by the weight of money and power. But today, something was different. Today, Jasmine and Marcus were about to change the course of history. Jasmine stood at the front, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could feel the weight of the moment on her shoulders, the eyes of Mill Creek watching her, waiting for the truth to be told. Beside her, Marcus stood strong, his expression resolute. He had seen the ugliness of the world, had watched as the system chewed up people like Elijah. But today, they were taking it all back. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about every black man and woman who had ever been wronged, every life that had been erased, every family that had been torn apart by the color of their skin. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped up to the microphone. She wasn't the same girl who had fled Mill Creek in fear. No, she had changed. The fire burning inside her now was unstoppable. "Thank you all for being here," Jasmine began, her voice steady but powerful. "We stand here today not just for Elijah, but for all the lives that have been stolen, for all the families who have been left to mourn in silence while the powerful continue to walk free. Today, that ends." She paused, looking out over the crowd, seeing the faces of people who had never dared to question the system they lived in. Some of them were nodding, some were hesitant, but all of them were listening. The truth was finally about to be heard. Jasmine turned to Marcus, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. She knew that he had already begun his work behind the scenes, reaching out to the media, securing testimonies, and preparing the legal groundwork. They had the evidence, they had the truth, and now they had the power to make it matter. "We have uncovered a story that's been hidden for far too long," Jasmine continued. "For years, the Preston family, with their wealth and influence, used their power to silence the truth. They made sure that the man who killed Elijah, who took a father from his children, would never face justice. But that stops today." The crowd was silent, absorbing every word. Jasmine could feel the weight of their skepticism, but she also felt their hope, rising like a swell in the ocean. "We've gathered evidence, we've spoken to witnesses, and we've found that the story you've been told is a lie. Elijah wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal. He was a man who had his life taken from him for no other reason than his skin color. And today, We're going to make sure that everyone knows it." Jasmine's hands were trembling now. But it wasn't fear. It was the energy of the moment, of what they were about to do. She could feel the collective heartbeat of Mill Creek. The fear and the hope. The tension and the anticipation. She wasn't alone in this fight. She could hear the voices of the people who had been silenced. The voices of those who had waited for a day like this. Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding. "We've been working with local journalists, investigators, and attorneys. We've exposed the corruption, the cover-ups, and the lies that have kept this town in the dark for too long. Today, we stand not only for Elijah, but for everyone who's been wronged by the system. We are not afraid. We will not be silenced." He glanced over at Jasmine, his eyes filled with pride. She had come back to Mill Creek to fight for justice, and now she was leading it, and we will not stop until justice is served. Marcus finished, his voice firm, resolute. Jasmine's heart surged. This was at the moment they had worked for, the moment that could change everything. But as the words hung in the air, the realization hit her. This was only the beginning. They had exposed the lies, but they still had to fight for justice. They still had to bring Kyle Preston to trial. They still had to face the wrath of the Preston family, who would do everything in their power to bury the truth again. But Jasmine didn't care. They had taken the first step, and she would see it through to the end. As the press conference ended, the cameras followed Jasmine and Marcus as they walked toward the courthouse. Their steps resolute. The battle wasn't over, but they had just made their first strike. Mill Creek was waking up. The people were waking up, and they weren't going to be silenced anymore. That night, Jasmine sat alone in her apartment, staring at the city below. The lights of Mill Creek twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in years, she could see something she hadn't been able to before: hope. She had spent so long running from the pain, from the injustice, from the system that had betrayed her and her community. But now, she was standing in the light, ready to fight for what was right. She wasn't alone anymore, and no matter how hard the fight would get, she knew she had the strength to see it through. Elijah's voice, his memory, would not be forgotten, and together, they would make sure the truth would never be silenced again. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Mill Creek had never seen a trial like this. For years, the town had been steeped in a culture of silence, where the powerful had walked free while the rest of the community suffered in silence. But today, that was all changing. Today, the truth was finally coming to light, and Jasmine was determined to make sure it stayed that way. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the whispers grew louder. Jasmine could feel the weight of every eye on her. But she didn't flinch. This wasn't about her. This was about Elijah. This was about every black man and woman who had ever been wronged by the system. This was about the truth being heard. Marcus stood beside her, his presence as solid as ever. He had been working behind the scenes for weeks, gathering evidence, securing witnesses, and preparing for this day. His role was quiet but essential. He had made sure that the press was covering every step of the trial, ensuring the world would be watching as the Preston family was held accountable. They sat in their seats as the judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. The prosecution, led by a passionate and experienced attorney, began by laying out the case against Kyle Preston. They had the evidence, surveillance footage, eyewitness testimonies, and expert analysis that proved Elijah's death was not the result of any crime or threat, but of a cold-blooded murder fueled by racial prejudice. The case was airtight. But then, as expected, the defense began. It was clear that the Preston family had more than enough resources to mount a strong defense. And Kyle Preston's lawyer was no exception. The lawyer spoke with polished confidence, spinning a narrative designed to paint Kyle as a victim, a man simply defending himself against an aggressive black man. The familiar arguments about fear, self-defense, and threats were trotted out with ease. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She had been preparing for this moment for months. The courtroom was filled with emotion. Families in the audience sat in quiet expectation, their faces a mix of hope, frustration, and anger. Many had heard the whispers about Kyle Preston's guilt, but this was the first time the truth had been laid bare in front of everyone. There was no turning back now. When Jasmine stood to speak, the room fell silent. She had been working tirelessly to make sure the truth came out. But now, standing before the jury and the crowd, her heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath and spoke. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because a man lost his life for no reason other than the color of his skin. Elijah Johnson was not a criminal. He was not a threat. He was a father, a brother, a friend. He was a man who should still be here with us today. But because of the actions of Kyle Preston, a man who has lived his life in the bubble of privilege and power, Elijah's life was stolen. Yasmina Bauset, her voice growing steadier with each word. I know some of you may have doubts. I know some of you may have heard stories about Elijah, about the kind of man he was. But let me tell you something. Elijah was a man who believed in justice. He believed in the system, even when the system had failed him. And today, it's our turn to make sure that justice is done. She turned to the jury, her eyes focused. We have presented the evidence. We have shown you the facts. Kyle Preston killed Elijah, and it's time for him to face the consequences. It's time for this town to face the truth. Because if we let this go, if we allow a man to walk free after committing murder, we are telling every black man and woman in this town that their lives don't matter. The room was silent as Jasmine finished speaking. She could see the jury's eyes on her, their expressions serious. They had heard the evidence, and now it was up to them to make sure that the truth would prevail. As the trial continued, Jasmine's nerves were high. The Preston family had deep pockets and powerful allies. And Jasmine knew that Kyle Preston's defense team would stop at nothing to paint Elijah as a threat. But with every piece of evidence, with every testimony from witnesses who had seen the truth, the case grew stronger. But there were moments of doubt. Jasmine couldn't help but feel the weight of the entire town watching, the weight of the years of injustice that had gone unchecked. She had seen how easily the system had allowed the powerful to remain above reproach. She had seen how many had walked away from their responsibility to fight for what was right. But she couldn't turn away. She couldn't let Elijah's death be buried under a mountain of lies. For every time she thought about giving up, she thought about his family, his children, who deserved justice just as much as anyone else. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about changing the system. It was about proving that black lives did matter. It was about showing the world that no amount of money or power could shield someone from the consequences of their actions. As the trial neared its end, the tension was unbearable. The jury deliberated for what seemed like hours. But in reality, it was only a matter of minutes before they returned with their verdict. The room was silent as the judge called the jury back to the stand. Jasmine held her breath, her heart racing as the words were spoken. Guilty. Kyle Preston is guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in disbelief and relief. Jasmine's heart soared. For the first time in years, she could feel the weight lift from her chest. She had won. They had won. Justice had been served. But the fight wasn't over. As Jasmine looked at Marcus, she knew they had only begun to make a difference. The real work, the work of healing, of changing the system, of ensuring that no one else would ever have to go through what Elijah's family had endured, was just beginning. And Jasmine was ready to keep fighting, no matter what. The weeks following the verdict felt like a blur. The town of Mill Creek had been shaken to its core, the echoes of the trial reverberating through every street. Jasmine could feel the weight of the victory, but it wasn't the kind of victory that would make everything right. It was just the beginning. The Preston family's influence had been torn down, but Jasmine knew that the battle for justice was far from over. Elijah's family, though relieved, now faced the difficult road ahead, healing from the years of pain, navigating a world that still held so much injustice. But for the first time in her life, Jasmine could sense a shift. The town was waking up. People were finally seeing the truth for what it was. Elijah's mother, Sarah, approached Jasmine one evening, her face solemn yet filled with gratitude. "You did it," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of sorrow. "You gave us justice. You gave us our son back. Even though he's not here, I don't think anyone could have done what you did. You made sure we were heard." Jasmine held Sarah's hand. the bond between them unspoken but strong. "This isn't just about Elijah," Jasmine replied. "This is about all of us. This is about making sure that no mother, no father, no child has to go through what your family has been through. We've all been silenced for too long. But now, we have a voice. We have the power to change things." Marcus had been by her side every step of the way, helping not just with the legal aspects but with the community outreach that followed the trial. They both knew that the hard work had just begun. With the trial behind them, they focused their efforts on reform, on building the kind of future where justice wasn't a matter of who you knew or how much money you had. Jasmine and Marcus spent their days organizing community meetings, speaking to local leaders, and bringing people together who had never before been given a seat at the table. But it wasn't just about politics. It was about healing. It was about building a future where no one felt the weight of injustice every time they stepped out their door. Jasmine had spent so many years fighting the system, but now she found herself fighting for something greater: hope. One evening, Jasmine found herself standing at Elijah's grave, her heart heavy with everything they had gone through. She had spent so many nights here, asking herself if she had done enough, if Elijah's death and everything that followed had been worth it. As the sun set behind her, casting a warm golden light over the cemetery, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known before. Elijah's death had started a movement. His life, his legacy, had sparked something in her, in the town, in everyone who had witnessed the fight for justice. She knew now, as she stood in front of his grave, that he had never truly been gone. His spirit lived on in every moment they fought for change, for truth. Jasmine turned and walked away from the grave, feeling a lightness in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it felt like a road worth traveling. As the years went by, Jasmine's work continued to touch lives. The Preston family's empire had crumbled, but the real victory was in what came after: the changes in the community, the conversations about race and justice that could now take place without fear of backlash. People were finally listening. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but Jasmine could see the progress. She could see the change. The legacy of Elijah Johnson lived on, not just in the trial, but in the ripple effect it had caused. The case had become a symbol of what could happen when ordinary people stood up to power. It was a reminder that, no matter how long it took, the truth would always come to light. Justice was a fight, but it was a fight worth having. And as Jasmine looked around at the people she had helped, those who had once been silenced but now stood strong, she knew that it was just the beginning. A new generation of activists, fighters, and leaders had emerged, and they were ready to continue the work. Jasmine had ignited a spark, and she was confident that it would never go out. As she stood in front of a community meeting hall, watching people of all backgrounds and experiences come together, she realized that the world had changed. Maybe not in the grand ways she had imagined, but in the quiet ways that truly mattered. People were listening, people were learning, and most importantly, people were taking action. The battle for justice would never be over. But Jasmine was no longer fighting it alone. Thank you for watching this heart-stirring story of love, loss, and redemption. We hope it touched your heart and inspired reflection on the power of human connection. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories. Your support means the world to us and helps bring more meaningful stories to life. Share your thoughts below, and we'll see you next time.